The Print off the Cuff. Presenting partner Edelweiss. Exchange partner NSC. Experience partner The Quorum. Gifting partner VAHDAM India. Beverage partner Chivas Luxe Collective Perfumes.
Welcome to another episode of The Print off the Cuff in Mumbai at the Quorum Club. I'm so happy to see all of you here and so privileged to introduce our guest, Vijay Gokhale, former IFS officer, Foreign Secretary, Ambassador to China. Ambassador to China at a very critical time, and that is where I will set up the first question. And Ambassador to Germany, and has done lots of other tours of duty across the world as foreign service officers do. Is a Punekar, was born in Bombay, was born in Bombay, went to school in Bombay, college in Delhi, St. Stephen's College, but so now settled in Pune. His latest book has just come out. He's a prolific author and columnist. Swasti, show it. I will read out. Sadly, copies are not available in India as yet. They're only on Amazon, or we would have got some copies there for you to sign. This is China's Wars, the politics and diplomacy behind its military coercion, which is something that everybody's talking about, and we in India worry about all the time. And that's where the first question comes in. Vijay, you handled India-China relations during some of the most difficult years. The Doklam crisis, for example. Looking back, particularly after Galwan and the prolonged border crisis, was India guilty of fundamentally misreading Xi Jinping?
Well, first of all, Shekhar, thank you for inviting me on your program Off the Cuff. It's a great pleasure. And also a pleasure to meet Swasti Rao. Shekhar, it's like this. After the Cold War ended in 1990, and Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi made his visit to China around that time, a new modus vivendi was worked out between him and the late Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. And it essentially stood on three pillars. So we made a compromise in not insisting that the boundary question is settled before we can normalize relations. So we agreed to a dual track approach where we normalize our bilateral relations on the one hand and discuss the boundary issue on the other. That was a compromise on our part. The Chinese compromised by giving an assurance that they will not use force or threaten the use of force before the boundary is settled. And therefore that peace and tranquility will prevail on the boundary, which was important for us. And the third was a sort of vague assurance that both sides gave to each other that we would not impede the other's quote unquote rise, because we were both aspirational powers hoping to have a greater share of the global economy. And that brought 25 years, a quarter century of stability in the relationship. Of course, a few things changed in the beginning of this century, and we were a little late in recognizing those changes. One, of course, was Russia was back in the game once President Putin assumed office. So once again, China was playing within a triangular balance of power, the United States, Russia, and China. Secondly, of course, China made huge diplomatic inroads globally, and therefore the need for us became less and less as it developed its own relations with other neighbors, ASEAN, Japan, Russia itself, and so on and so forth. And thirdly, of course, there was a phenomenal growth gap in the GDP. So whereas in 1990, our GDP was more or less the same as China's, roughly about 350 billion. China was 390 billion, we were 350 billion. By 2010, we were at 1.2 trillion, but China was at 7 or 8 trillion. So for all these reasons, the Chinese, I think, came to the conclusion that they didn't have to be as sensitive to India's concerns anymore. And so what you see after 2005 is a steady backtracking of commitments they made. The peak was the year 2005 when we signed the agreement on the principles for settling the boundary. But subsequently, you see in 2007, first the description of Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. Then in 2008 and 9, you see the introduction of visas for people born in Arunachal Pradesh and Jammu and Kashmir. And then from 2013, you see incidents on the border. So yes, I think we were somewhat late in recognizing that the trend had changed. But I think by 2010 or 2011, the government of India, in my opinion, was very well aware that the situation was undergoing change, and we were adjusting to that change. So I wouldn't say that we didn't judge Xi Jinping correctly. I would say that we were a little slow in the beginning, but I think we had pretty much got a measure of things by the second decade of this century, that is roughly around 2010, 2011.
Yeah, and that was a couple of years before Xi Jinping took over.
Yes, that's right. Yes. He took over in 2013.
Yes. And what do you think made that change?
Well, as I said, largely because they felt that they had economically, militarily, diplomatically gained so much ground over India that they didn't need to be sensitive to India's concerns anymore. At a much more basic level, China never considered India to be an equal, and it still does not consider India to be an equal. It saw itself essentially as a peer only to the United States and the Soviet Union, and now to some degree the Russian Federation. So it always expected India to acquiesce, to accept its concerns as legitimate, but not necessarily to accommodate our concerns. And I think that's manifesting itself again now, but it has actually manifested itself throughout the relationship. Our judgmental error, I would say, was to assume that because we looked at China as an equal power, they would reciprocate. That, of course, is not the case.
Swasti?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and see so many friends among the audience. Let me just throw another analytical problem that I see with all that you just said about India and China. And I'm reminded of Professor Kanti Bajpayee's, he wrote a book again, India versus China, where he gave this very profound sort of structural problems that we have. And he said that over the decades, what has happened with respect to all that you said, he said that there are 4 P's that need to be studied. So there is definitely a kind of a misperception, and that perception is negative, among both populations. Of course, that is coming from this long-standing perimeter or the border problem. Then he says that even though when we were in so-called partnerships, we were not able to utilize it properly, and then the power asymmetry was what really worsened it. And then after that, in other latter editions, he said that after these 4 Ps, then there's a 5th P, which is Pakistan, which sort of takes this conversation to a different geopolitical angle. My question to you, Vijay, would be that, considering that in your latest book as well, you mentioned that the structural problems remain, and yet if you look at the evolution of China's wars against India, what we need to be worrying about now is the gray zone destabilization. So just help me make a sense of all this together. Now we're trying to sort of also have a rapprochement with China because of so much geopolitical uncertainty and unpredictability because of Mr. T. But having said that, do you think, or what is the degree to which we can call it a rapprochement that can work in our favor as well, considering all these limitations?
So basically the old framework has collapsed and it's irretrievably broken. We can't rebuild the framework of India-China relations which existed before the Galwan incident and before the East Ladakh incursions of 2020. We don't have any idea what a new framework looks like, and I think that's really the challenge before the government currently on how to build that new framework. But one thing is clear. Peaceful coexistence, as we understood it, which is a lightly armed, lightly equipped boundary or a border between India and China, is no longer possible. It's going to be a heavily armed boundary or a border with huge financial implications on the exchequer and on the public. And I think we have to accept that simply because we cannot afford to leave a boundary or a border undefended or lightly defended, because every incursion has a political cost and a reputational cost for us as well, aside from, of course, the loss of territory or land that might happen as a result of that. So we are in a state of armed coexistence right now. The question is whether China intends to use force to get its way with India, or whether it can adopt other means. I know that many people in India think that the Chinese are hardwired to use force against us, and I'm not ruling out that possibility because China is an opportunistic power. But if you look at it rationally, and the people in Beijing are rational people, highly educated, technically qualified, and cadre based, That's the Communist Party. This is not a Putin-esque government. This is a government based on cadres of extremely highly educated people. It makes very little sense for them to use massive force against us for a variety of reasons. Number one, of course, is 1962 is not 2026. For China, they have to have a decisive victory to call it a victory. In our case, we don't have to lose and we win. Now, I don't think that there is any clear path to them having a decisive victory over us. Secondly, I think we are going to be, even if we grow at 5-6% a year and not at 8 or 9% a year, the world's second or third largest market by 2050. If their goal is to topple the United States from the perch of the number one economy, can you afford to ignore the Indian market? And the answer is no. Because if you are going to leave 1 billion people out, or let's say 500 million people, because the purchasing power of the other 500 million or 700 million may not be enough, I don't think that you can actually get the number one status in the global economy. So economically, it makes no sense either. And lastly, their existential threat comes from the East, from the United States. The only country with which they can have a two-front conflict is if India joins the United States. Japan anyway is an ally of the United States, and it's all on one front. ASEAN doesn't provide a challenge, Central Asia doesn't provide a challenge, and the Russians are friends. So really, do you want a two-front war when you're fighting an existential threat from the United States? And the obvious answer is no. On the other hand, I think you have to keep India in check, and therefore there are two ways of doing so. One is to continually mount pressure on the line of actual control through grey zone coercion, which is exactly what they're doing, which effectively means that along this entire line of actual control stretching over 3,000 kilometers, you make small military or quasi-military actions which keep the Indian troops in a defensive and constantly anxious state of affairs, so that you debilitate India financially as well as militarily. And the other is, of course, our western neighbor Pakistan, which they use on and off to keep us in check. And I think that's the broad Chinese strategy. And I think going ahead in the next 10 years, that's what you're going to see. We have to be prepared for greater grey zone coercion on the line of actual control. But I don't think that there's going to be a major conflict of any kind, because it doesn't suit the Chinese.
I have a follow-up question there, because you mentioned the armed coexistence in such detail. Is that also what you mean by hot shelving? It's a concept that you've been using in your writings, and especially in the hot shelving. So obviously he's going to tell that, but I think the point is that China would keep you in an equilibrium, but it is going to sort of, instead of cold shelving the issues, it's going to be hot shelving the issues. But since we have you here, why don't you just tell the audience and also us what do you really mean by that?
Yeah, so essentially, cold shelving, of course, is an old phrase. It essentially means keeping a problem on the shelf or in the refrigerator and not agitating it so that it doesn't become an obstacle. Hot shelving is where that problem is kept on a shelf, but it is kept continually bubbling and boiling so that it causes anxiety to the other side, but is never allowed to boil over into an armed conflict. And I think what we are seeing from 2013 onwards, particularly with this leader in China, is the idea where along the boundary, all those points which were disputed, rather than keeping them on the shelf and forgetting about them, they are all kept in a state of active inertia. In other words, they're not, it's not that we are going to land in a conflictual position, but on and off they activate this problem and they keep it alive to remind us that there is a challenge to the north, and that if we don't toe the line, to put it bluntly, they can activate this. And that's what I mean by hot shelving. It's actually a concept used in the People's Liberation Army's latest strategic guidelines of 2020. So the People's Liberation Army, the Academy of Military Sciences, produces a strategy paper every decade or so. The latest one is 2020, or the latest one that the world knows about is 2020. The concept of hot shelving is actually in that. And it's the same year, of course, that Galwan happened.
So take us back. Let's take you backwards from Galwan. Let's take you to Doklam. Describe your days in Beijing those days.
Well, I haven't ever spoken about it because,
There's always a first time.
yeah, but I'll speak of it in general terms because I don't think it's appropriate to for me particularly
as much
having been in that.
as much as you would as a
So
diplomat.
basically, from 2013 onwards, there was a shift in the way in which the Chinese behaved, not only with us but with all the neighbors. Deng Xiaoping's basic foreign policy.
Can I interrupt you for a second? 2013 is the watershed year because that's when Xi Jinping takes over.
So Deng Xiaoping's basic foreign policy and national security strategy was a 24-character strategy, which is simplified as hide and bide, which is hide your capabilities and bide your time. His view was that until China became strong militarily and economically, there was no point in raising one's head and demonstrating one's sense of importance or leadership. By 2013, when President Xi Jinping came to power, the circumstances, according to him, had changed. Economically, after the global financial crisis, China felt that they had held up the world when the West was in crisis, and therefore economically they were a peer to the West. Militarily, they were much stronger, and diplomatically their influence was great. And so he changed this hide and bide strategy to a strategy which was called striving for achievement. I mean, it's a bit of an obscure term in English, that what it essentially meant was China would move from a reactive foreign and national security policy to a proactive national security and foreign policy. And so what you see is a more assertive, and if you ask many people in India or among the other neighborhood, they will say aggressive foreign policy, where China begins to say that any action which is against my interest will be countered with a severe repercussion. So long before Doklam, we see this first in 2013 in a place called Depsang in Ladakh. Then in 2014 in a place called Chumar, and that happened when Xi Jinping was actually in India on his first visit, and our Prime Minister had just assumed office a few months before. And Doklam is then subsequently an incident that happens in succession to that, and then Galwan. Now, what you see is actually an expansion of this whole approach of putting pressure on you. So Depsang is a very tiny point, and the dispute goes on for a matter of a couple of days. Then Chumar in 2014 went for a couple of weeks. Doklam went for a couple of months. And then Galwan went for 4 years. For 4 years, it was unresolved. So what you see is a prolongation of the pressure, a widening of the tactic to keep you under pressure, the fact that you then do it at multiple points at the same time. And all this, in fact, suggests that, the Chinese strategy is to basically keep you pinned down and to keep you confined to South Asia. Now, of course, we might ask ourselves why that is the case, because I think militarily, economically, and diplomatically, the gap is still very, very great. And the only reason I can think of, and this is a personal view, I don't know whether many people share it, but I think that India poses for China an ideological threat. At the end of the day, we are a country which elects its own leaders every 5 years and which has a democratic society where you can express your opinion. For China, which is a single party state, which has told its people that you don't need democracy in order to progress, it becomes difficult to explain, I think, to its people after a certain point of time, how another neighbor, which is as big, as diverse, as complex, is able to or is allowed to elect its people. So I think they see Indian democracy in a sense as a longer term ideological problem. And I think their idea of diminishing India in some way, embarrassing us, embarrassing the government, humiliating the people, is in some way an attempt to ensure that Indian democracy never poses a challenge. Of course, now I also notice some kind of a mindset change happening in that for the first time, I think if you see Chinese writings in the last 3 or 4 years, that absolute certainty that they would outpace India year after year after year to infinity is going. they now think that the gap is not going to grow very much more. It may not reduce unless you grow at 9 or 10% per annum. But that linear growth that we saw between 2000 and 2020 is over. So to that extent, then it means the window begins to close where India is able to more and more compete with China over a medium to long term. And that's also changing the mindset. So I think a few changes are happening in China. It's not immediately evident to the Aam Janta. But I think we have to keep an eye on these trends because they will lead to some adjustment in Chinese policy towards us.
So basically, maybe in one sentence each, what were the Chinese trying to tell us in Doklam and then Galwan or East Ladakh? And was it the same thing? Or was there something common there?
So there are plenty of explanations one can give. My explanation is that they were increasingly uncomfortable with our tilt towards the United States. They don't look upon you as a threat, but when you tilt towards one or another major power, you become an adjunct threat. It happened in the 50s with America, it happened in the 80s with Soviet Union, and it's happened in the 2010s with the United States as well. I think the message both in Doklam and in Galwan was that if you cohabit with the Americans in a manner which is threatening to us, and Quad was also part of that whole mindset in their view, we have the means to ensure that we have the means to hit back. And I think this was the way in which a certain message was being said to us. But there are many other people with many different explanations. So I don't think that this is the only one.
No, I mean, yeah, I can totally see your hand there. But, meanwhile, I'll just have a follow-up question on that because, you've been mentioning that our relationship with China has also had this one angle that has been the Russian angle. And now with 4 years, now the 5th year of war in Ukraine is on and we don't really see a clear end in sight. I just wanted your understanding, Vijay, on how do you see that Russia and India still remain each other's room for maneuver at a time when sort of Russia is getting more and more dependent on China, not just geopolitically, diplomatically, but also for chips and for technology. People that traveled to Russia recently would allude to the fact that the cars are Chinese and everything is Chinese, the chips are Chinese. So just the Russia angle a little bit. We need to engage Russia, but then objectively speaking, how do you look at the tilt that Russia has had on China in the last 4 or 5 years?
So to my mind, the tilt towards Russia is out of compulsion. It's not voluntary. The West has sanctioned Russia. And therefore, the only markets they have are China primarily and to a very limited extent India and Southeast Asia and of course the rest of the global South. But none of us are in any way in market size compared to China. China is buying their energy, which the West has refused to buy, both gas and oil. And they are getting high technology from the Chinese, which they would otherwise get from the Europeans, the Germans in particular, and the French. That does not mean that there are no problems between them, but we choose not to see it. The world chooses not to see it. Firstly, of course, I don't think the Russians like the fact that the Chinese are getting energy at prices which are less than at market rates. But the Russians have no option. Where do they sell oil and gas if not to China? Secondly, there is a real fear in Russia that China's claim on the Russian Far East, because as you know, parts of the Russian Far East were actually parts of the Chinese Empire until the Tsars took them away, and it became part of Russia in the 19th century. There is a real concern that illegal immigration, and that's happening right now, will eventually lead to the Chinese reoccupation of what is today the Eastern Siberia. Yes. Thirdly, there is intense competition on the Arctic. Russia is very worried that China, by claiming to be a near Arctic power, will actually start using influence in the Arctic, which is now becoming a new route, thanks to global warming, to get goods moving so that you're not dependent on the Malacca Strait and the Suez Canal. There are a number of fractures between them, but these are papered over. Now, if we assume that Russia-China relations are in a way detrimental to us, I think we are assuming wrongly. First of all, Russia and India have no fundamental conflict of interest. There's no territorial dispute, there's no political problem, there's no economic competition. Secondly, I don't think the Russians want to depend entirely on the Chinese. The axiom that the enemy of your enemy is your friend applies here too. China has in the past been inimical to Russia for a long period of time. They've seen Russia as a threat. So I think the relationship with India is important.
They've had border clashes.
Apart from border clashes, they had actually very serious ideological problems right through from 1970s to the 90s.
So strong it split the Communist Party of India.
Yes, you're right.
One pro-Moscow, one pro-Beijing, CPI and CPM.
Yeah. So I think that, we should, lastly, the point I want to make is a closer Russia-China relationship has not yet compromised our relationship with Russia. It is not as if they have given the same sort of weapons to the Chinese as they have given to us, nor was it a fact that they shut off supplies to us during the crises in Doklam and Galwan when we needed ammunition and other bits and pieces of equipment. So we should not assume that this is a zero-sum game. For us, Russia is a vital partner. We need to develop that relationship for national security reasons, but also for economic reasons: oil, gas, timber, raw materials, fertilizers, and so on. And lastly, also because Russia, like China and India, is a civilizational state. They are maybe down and out now, but I don't think you can write them off.
Vijay talks a lot about China, writes a lot about China. He studied the country, he speaks the language. So I will tell you a little story. In 1989, Tiananmen Square massacre, I went there to cover the massacre with the photographer Prashant Panjiyar for India Today magazine. And Western media was full of stories of 25th Army's revolting, 32nd Army, 27th Army. All of them are revolting and they are marching on Beijing, and soon Chinese communist rule will be over, etc., etc. And that is what the Western diplomats were also saying. And then I went to the Indian embassy, our ambassador then, Mr. Ranganathan.
Yes.
He said, you meet my political team, and the gentleman heading the political team was Shekhar Menon, and he then took me to lunch with three of his younger colleagues, two of whom rose to become foreign secretaries. So there is one. And then what did I hear from them? They said to me that, look, whatever you are reading in the Western press, etc., kuch nahi hone wala. No 25th, 27th, 32nd Army is coming. By tomorrow, they will be using water hoses to clean the roads. So any pictures you want of blood, etc., do it now. Within a day or two, they'll be holding very quick public trials and executing people who they pronounce guilty, and this will be over. And I think we heard that expression also, slaughtering the chicken in public to scare the monkeys. So that's my little personal experience and my first interaction with him. And I was just reminding him that this was a new fancy Chinese restaurant. China was opening up, where all the staff had been taught English, and while they talked to us in English, these three were talking to them in Chinese, which threw them a little bit. So after that story, Vijay, do you think we erred a little bit in going and relying too much on this ceremonial stuff? Wuhan, Mamallapuram, little bits of meetings on the side here and there. Did we get caught up in form over substance?
I'm not sure about that. Of course, I'm biased, I have to admit, because I was the foreign secretary during that time.
Yes.
I should make that disclosure. But, I think the objective of those two, don't forget it came right after Doklam, right? So
Yes.
Doklam was 2017, and then there was the meeting of the two leaders immediately after that at the BRICS summit. And essentially, I think what the Indian side felt was that perhaps a new effort had to be made in order to build a modus vivendi between the two sides, because by then it was very evident that the old arrangement, which had outlived its life, was fraying. I don't think that the objective of Wuhan and Mamallapuram, the two informal summits that were held between the two leaders, was an attempt to resolve problems. If you know the Chinese, they don't resolve problems at the leadership level. This is a very Western approach. problems are resolved at the functional level, the leader only comes to give blessings. And therefore, the presumption that the leader is going to come and solve your problems is a mistake to begin with. And therefore, there was no intention of actually having these dialogues in order to solve a problem. It was in order to explore an understanding. It was very much, for instance, in the way in which a number of Soviet US leadership meetings would take place. They never actually resulted in anything, but they built an understanding. I think that understanding was important to build. I don't think that Galwan disrupted that understanding at a broader political level. But yes, the military consequences of that did result in mistrust between the two sides. That mistrust has not entirely gone. Now, of course, going ahead, I'm sure that you will see meetings between the two leaders again. Whether it will be a bilateral visit, because we haven't had one after 2019. It's been 7 years. Neither our Prime Minister has gone there nor has their President come, is something I can't speak to. But I think certainly there will be forward movement, you will see. Frankly, Shekhar, I mean, we are two nuclear weapon states. You cannot not talk to each other. If you don't talk to each other, the chances of a mishap are greater. And talking to each other doesn't mean you're compromising either on the border or on any other thing. It just means you're keeping the lines of communication open. So yes, political dialogue is necessary.
Hi, this is Chinmay Shah from Mumbai. I just wanted to ask, it's interesting you mentioned that the leaders are sometimes not ceremonial, but more, a lot of the things happen at the functional level. But it, as you said, it's pretty clear that there was a shift in strategy or a shift in mindset after 2013 when Xi Jinping came to power. So what are the chances that, at some point, maybe it's 5 years or 7 years, whatever it is, someone else, obviously after Xi Jinping comes in and goes back maybe not completely but partially to another mindset, to the old mindset, or what are the chances of that happening? Because clearly he has been a shift after 40 years of some policy being in place. Now, would that continue or would that sort of go back? That's my question.
No, it's likely to continue simply because China now sees itself on the path to certainly being a peer to the United States, but still harboring the view that they can actually topple the United States. I don't mean in any physical or military sense, but topple it from its perch as being the global hegemon. And if that is the case, then with every single neighbor of theirs, their objective is to ensure that you do not get close enough to the United States, whether it is Japan, Vietnam, the Philippines, or India, these are really the four, to threaten China's national security interests. It's as simple as that. So I think what we have to accept is that the best we can hope for is a stable and predictable relationship with China, which allows us to carry on with our own developmental business without having to spend too much, although we have to spend much more than we did before 2019. But I don't think that beyond that we are ever going to be friends or we're ever going to be partners in the sense that we are with Japan today or even the United States, despite all the setbacks that are there.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Abhishek Nimborkar. I'm right at the back. I work in corporate strategy. It's a pleasure to be an audience to this conversation. Since you've spent around 4 decades in diplomacy, my question is related to that. The way I understand diplomacy is building back channels and multilateral frameworks, etc. But in recent times, what Mr. Trump has shown us is that you can bypass all of that and still move the world. So my question is, do you think the old ways of diplomacy are dying? Are they rewriting the playbook? And then how is the world adapting? And especially India, how do you see this diplomacy changing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Diplomacy has, of course, changed over the last 200 to 300 years, ever since the concept of permanent representation in a foreign country began, roughly around the time of the Napoleonic Wars. But each time a new technology has come and the death of diplomacy has been predicted, diplomacy has continued. So first the telegraph came, then the telephone came, then the fax machine came, then of course you had the internet, and now you have the social media. Each time they said, well, you really don't need diplomats in other countries anymore because you can now pick up the telephone, you can email somebody, you can fax somebody. The fact is that you still need people to do the work of conversations. You can't have prime ministers can't speak on the telephone and resolve everything, and nor can you do it via the internet. What has changed is that the mobile phone has given the ability for every one of India's 1.4 or 1.5 billion citizens to have a view on foreign policy. So foreign policy has become democratized in India over the last 15 or 20 years, which was not the case before. It was, for want of a better word, an elitist pursuit. Today, of course, an individual's view on any particular issue, whether it's an informed view or not, can become viral and does force the government or compel the government to take cognizance and, if necessary, to change policy. So I think that is a difficult factor to adjust to, and Indian diplomacy is, of course, adjusting to it. That's one aspect. The other aspect is the digital world. Today, you can use digital means to very subtly interfere in the internal affairs of others. There are a number of studies which have been done over the last 2 years even by Microsoft, for instance, or by Rand Corporation, where the Chinese or the Russians, and I have no doubt the Americans and the Europeans are doing it as well, very subtly use certain algorithms or certain platforms to inject what seem to be perfectly normal ideas innocently into conversation in a manner that they cannot be traced back, which fundamentally influence a country's thinking politically, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. That's the second challenge diplomacy has to deal with. I mean, you have to deal with social media and about the public having a view on foreign policy, but you also got to deal with interference through social media about your own policies, both domestic and foreign. So that's a new challenge, second challenge. The third challenge, of course, is that you today, of course, with the digital, with artificial intelligence, a lot of things which were earlier parts of diplomacy are not relevant anymore. Gathering facts is not relevant anymore, simply because the internet gives you more facts than you can get by posting diplomats on the ground. Even the analytical part is gone because ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity does it for you. So what is needed is critical thinking. Critical thinking is necessary because once you have that analysis, there are 20 different options, and I don't think AI can actually tell you this is the best option for India or for a particular situation. You still need the human brain to do that. And for that, you need people on the ground. You can't have virtual diplomats doing that. You need people who are there, who understand the situation, the culture, the society, the politics of that country, and then use what ChatGPT produces, but still apply the mind to say, this is the way in which we have to achieve that objective. So I don't think diplomacy is going to go anywhere. In fact, my own prediction, and I've said this quite openly, is that the one government service which actually is slated for expansion is the Indian Foreign Service. The rest of the government actually attrition will happen simply because a lot of the functions done by people will be done digitally or through artificial intelligence. But you can't negotiate through artificial intelligence, right? You have to have people to do that. The channel, whether it's back channel or front channel, you need people. And ultimately, that function is done under the transaction of business rules by the Indian Foreign Service. So I'm very convinced that diplomacy is vital. It will continue, but of course the methods have to change.
So I will tell you two things. Number one, individuals influencing foreign policy. It was one beat up BJP politician's tweet that forced Kolkata Knight Riders to send Mustafizur Rahman back, and that created such a big situation vis-a-vis Bangladesh, because cricket is a very emotional thing. Nobody in the government said it. It was just one really lightweight politician who said this on Twitter. And then other people took on and government stepped back, government intervened. BCCI told Kolkata Knight Riders not to hire him. And that created a lot of problem, and the new ambassador will now have to do repair work on that. So it was just one tweet. That's one. The second thing is on AI. See, sovereign powers, corporates, anybody can also train AI to suit their own purpose. And sovereign powers are very powerful and they have the resources. And this is something I discovered after Op Sindoor. when these citations came out, and many citations were not made public, particularly Vayu Medal, Nausena Medal, some Sena medals also, they were not made public. And I said, this is such a long gazette notification to read. Who will look at it? Let me ask Grok to read it for me. So I asked Grok, and what I got completely shocked me, because it completely made up stories. And when you took the sum and substance of those stories, that really was what the Pakistanis would have liked you to believe, that 6 or 8 Rafales barely survived being hit. One came on fire, and some woman who nursed it on the ground. It landed in Srinagar because it had lost its way, but she nursed it on the ground and saved the pilot. All of these look like heroic stories, but they were all fake and untrue. Now, where did Grok find them from? That's because somebody was filling up that space with that information. So it's also a dangerous thing that countries will use, and all countries will have to do both things. One, misuse it, and second, guard against misuse. That said, Sunil Alag.
My name is Sunil Alag. I just wanted to ask you, but so far we've discussed all the war portions. They are interested, China is interested in Taiwan and America at the moment, not interested in India at all. So as far as I'm concerned, Taiwan is the main issue, and so is America. But look, economic issues, the Modi government has said, look, you can invest in India. Nobody's discussed the economic issues. Up to now, nobody has discussed the economic issues except the possibility of war. Now, war is out of the question completely, because they are interested in Taiwan and we are not interested in Taiwan. We are not interested in America. America has got Trump. Every 2 months he changes his mind. Right now he's thinking of India, and right now he's thinking of America, and he's thinking of America makes it great again. But economic issues where Modi government has said, look, you can invest in India. And therefore, that is what we need to discuss more and more, because if economic issues become one of the things which we discuss with China, then the rest of the issues will become secondary, because they will affect economic issues as well as India.
No, I have no quarrel with that. I think we definitely have a problem economically, because the trade imbalance is worsening actually. And as Shekhar pointed, we were discussing this before this event, that actually we have only 3%, our trade with China is less than 3% of their trade, but the 1 out of every $10 of their trade surplus comes from India. So clearly that's a matter of concern. Now, the problem is that both countries approach it differently. The Chinese approach it as a purely market problem. If your product is not competitive, what can I do? And they are dissimulating, of course. It's disingenuous to say that, because there are barriers that they have put on things like, for example, IT-enabled services or pharma products which are FDA approved and European approved. We approach it as a political problem, because it is a political problem. When you have a $100 billion deficit, it's a political problem. However, I think simply putting the blame on the Chinese side would not be proper. The fact of the matter is that we have not been able to pivot towards substituting some of those manufacturing lines in industries which are not necessarily high-tech over the past 10 to 12 years, which we should have done under the Make in India program. So I think we have to now look at whether some of the policy deficiencies in our country need to be addressed or need to be redressed in order to ensure that those manufacturing lines come here. Of course, to a certain extent, China is to blame, because the barriers are there for some of the goods which are otherwise competitive, Indian goods which are otherwise competitive. But as I said, you can't put the blame on them. I just want to, since you brought up the Taiwan issue, I just want to make one comment there. We seem to think that Taiwan is not our concern because it's 5,000 kilometers away. Let me tell you that we are grossly underestimating the impact of a crisis in the Taiwan Strait on our country. I'm not talking of war. There is no such thing as war in the Taiwan Strait. If there is war, it is World War III, because the United States will be involved. I'm talking of crisis, blockade, as Iran has done with the Hormuz Strait, for instance, a quarantine, missiles into the Taiwan Strait, a cyber attack on Taiwan. And let me just very briefly tell you what the impact is going to be. Trade is clearly going to be impacted, right? Because any shipping east of the Malacca Strait will stop in the South China Sea. 40% of India's trade goes to the Malacca Strait. So any Indian exporter exporting through the Malacca Strait is going to take a hit. That problem is dwarfed by the fact that supply chains will collapse, because 30% of all global supply chains originate in China. And that means not only the Indian exporter, but the Indian importer importing from China is going to suffer. Now, if you think as a businessman, that's all right, I don't export east of the Malacca Strait, so I should be fine. It's not the case, because all supply chains globally will be disrupted, and therefore the West won't purchase your stuff even if you're not exporting east of the Malacca Strait. So you're going to have a problem with that. Number 3, even worse, 90% of all semiconductors come from that region, right? Taiwan, Japan, Korea, China. And you are a heavily services dependent economy. Your e-commerce will collapse, your e-logistics will collapse, your entertainment industry will collapse, your education industry will collapse. The unemployment implications will be massive and socially destabilizing for this country. You won't be able to order pizza, you will not be able to buy a car. And lastly, the 15 submarine cables from India to the Silicon Valley are anchored of Taiwan. In the last 2 years, China has cut 3 cables and demonstrated their capacity to do so. Your IT-enabled services will be crippled. The impact on India's economy will be massive. We have done no study in this regard. We do not understand the implications of this. We are totally unprepared for a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. So I think that we should not think Taiwan is too far, or that it's not my problem when the China invades Taiwan. It is one hell of a problem for us.
Just to add to what Vijay was just saying, and I think this is a missing part of, I think, the question that you asked, because oftentimes, we tend to think about the Taiwan Strait as, like the World War III and all the dangers that you just alluded to. But actually, that poses a very important national security challenge for us right away, because when we look at the gray zone and when we look at developing capabilities to protect the critical infrastructure, to try and insulate ourselves as much as possible, in the face of cyber security and the cyber attacks and so on. The problem is that, like he said, and I totally agree, that we don't really seem to have the capabilities. And for developing those capabilities, unlike what you do for big platforms or things which are pretty much decided by the Defense Acquisition Council and what weapons to buy, etc., when it comes to tackling the gray zone, that by definition is very complicated, because it requires a different kind of civil-military fusion. It requires the participation of big companies, of non-state actors, and it is also transnational in nature. So the countries that have been able to develop any response or any coherent, cogent response to gray zone destabilization have been able to do it with a very high level of civil-military fusion. And when we look at our country, I think we are simply only having conversations around it. There is no strategy for doing it. It remains very, very guarded. And frankly, that is something which is destabilizing us today. A war in Taiwan may come later, may come in 2027. I don't think in 2027, because Xi Jinping has purged almost everybody except himself. But whenever that comes, or if that comes, it's something which is shrouded in future. I think that is something we should be talking about. And just another point, I know there are so many questions, which is that India not being able to benefit from China Plus One diversification is completely an Indian thing. There is work that we need to do domestically, and that is something without which that particular dot cannot be connected.
Hello, I'm Kanika Kapoor from Swinwealth. Thank you for coming here this evening and having such an interesting conversation. You just discussed the grey zone today. From my understanding, that's a place between peace and war. So what I would like to understand from you is this space, grey zone, in the wealth management, we call it market volatility. And we always try and hedge market volatility. So in this ever-changing world, as Shekhar ji said, and as you said that China is constantly changing their strategy, will a diplomatic shield be a good enough defense for India, or should India or will India evaluate other strategies to hedge its geopolitical risk?
So the short answer is, you have to walk on two legs. You have to talk and you have to deter. That means diplomacy has to continue. You have to talk with the other side. But if you have to build deterrence, which means you have to invest in your defense infrastructure and in your defense industry, something which we are only now beginning to do when we should have done it 40 years ago. I think Galwan, in a sense, was a wake-up call because you actually fell short of stuff and you would not have been able to carry on a prolonged conflict. So the presumption that it's an either or is the wrong presumption to make. Diplomacy has to continue because that's the cheaper and better longer term solution. But behind that diplomacy, you have to be able to convey the message that we have the capability to deter. And really, I think that's what government policy is trying to do. Now, building a defense industry is not easy. First of all, you have an ideological problem in India because we all thought non-violence applied to everything. Fortunately, that mindset has changed. The view that, you must not export weapons everywhere else because it's an evil thing to do has changed. I mean, now it's okay, we are exporting weapons, but it still requires an effort to the R&D involved is substantial. Countries are not going to transfer technology to you of the cutting edge defense equipment. You have to build it, which means we have to invest in it, private sector and government both. I think that process has begun, but I think let's see how far it goes.
So just going back to Taiwan, recently when Trump was in China, I think the world was surprised by the audacity because they opened the conversation with warning Trump, and Trump did not utter a word, which is so uncharacteristic.
He quoted Thucydides.
Yeah. So in that context, do you think that the Taiwan crisis is closer or more probable than what we think? And also, I mean, just to be practical, I think we are in a quite helpless situation given the supply chain and the kind of dependence that we have on Chinese imports. And many of our exports also have the intermediate raw materials coming from there. Like 99% of world's vitamin C is made in China. So vitamin C, so what do you think, and how should we prepare ourselves for this?
Look, I think Taiwan is an emotional issue for the Chinese the way that Kashmir is for us. And sometimes when emotion is strong, it overrides logic or rationale. Therefore, the Western presumption that China may not do something because it is rationally not sensible to do so would be a mistaken judgment in my opinion. 2049 is the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China. I mean, I won't be around, but I can guarantee you that before that date, there will be reunification one way or another. Now, when it happens, we don't know. How desperate the Chinese are, we can't say. Certainly, Xi Jinping is looking for legacy, and therefore you cannot rule out the possibility that he may attempt something. He doesn't have to use force. My own personal view is the Americans are not going to come to Taiwan's defense because the public will not permit boots on the ground, and that's the only way you can deter the Chinese. But equally, the Iran war must be a very sobering lesson to the Chinese. That's another strait there. That was Hormuz, this is Taiwan, roughly the same distance. In fact, Hormuz is slightly narrower than Taiwan Strait. You could bomb Iran into the Stone Age, but you couldn't occupy it. You would have a huge number of body bags coming. I'm sure the Chinese have looked at it and realized that you might actually bomb Taiwan into the Stone Age, but occupation of that island is going to cost a lot of body bag in a country where one child is the norm, and where the demographics are not exactly working for that country. So I think it's given them pause for thought. On the other hand, we should never ever assume that this is not a high priority. This is a very high priority. A country which is seeking to be the dominant power in the world in the next century cannot stomach the fact that an island 150 nautical miles away is independent after 80 years of the existence of the People's Republic of China. It's galling to the Chinese, it's humiliating to them, and they're going to do something about it. Now, I think this is fairly obvious. I think the Iran war is a wake-up call for us. The presumption that oil would just flow permanently and we just were totally dependent on the Gulf. We never bothered to develop alternative sources from Africa or Southeast Asia. Is costing us right now. we should be waking up. But as I said, when I made my comments on Taiwan, I don't think that we are even thinking about the problem.
No, I think what we really realize that all our neighboring countries are kind of antagonistic right now. So how do you evaluate our foreign policy and what corrective measures can be taken?
I don't think that our neighboring countries are antagonistic towards us.
Look at Bangladesh, Pakistan, even Sri Lanka, Bhutan.
Let me just explain. First of all, I think we must accept the fact that we are a larger country and that a smaller neighbor is going to feel a certain degree of anxiety, the same way that we feel anxious about China. So I think, first of all, our size, our population, our economy intimidates the smaller neighbor, and that's natural. Secondly, we are in a very extremely unique position in the world. India has a common border with all its neighbors, but no neighbor has a common border with anybody else. Pakistan doesn't with Nepal, Nepal doesn't with Bhutan, Bhutan doesn't with Bangladesh, Bangladesh doesn't with Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka doesn't with Maldives. Ergo, who are they going to be having a problem with? They're only going to have a problem with you, right? Because this is not the case with China. In the case of China, China has a border with Myanmar, but Myanmar also has a border with India. In the case of Southeast Asia, it has with Laos and Cambodia, but they have borders with Vietnam. So India is in an extremely unique situation. Added to that is the historical complexity. You have ethnic or religious or linguistic groups on both sides of the border, which are there simply because the British arbitrarily drew lines. And therefore, you have a Tamil population in Sri Lanka, you have Bengali population in Bangladesh, you have Punjabi population in Pakistan, you have the Madhesis in Nepal. And of course, it agitates the elites.
And you have Pathans on both sides of the so-called Durand line.
So I think you have to accept that there is going to be a complex relationship. The government's policy basically is you have to accept the political reality and deal with it. And I think they've dealt fairly competently with it. In the Maldives, the president came in with an India out policy. Today, the same president understands that without India, the Maldives is not going to develop. The Sri Lankan president came in with a definite anti-India bias. Who helped him out in his economic crisis? President Dissanayake, not the Chinese. We did. And the same goes with Nepal and Bangladesh. I think we have to deal with the government of the day. We have to ensure that we have a prosper thy neighbor policy and not a beggar thy neighbor policy. And at the end of the day, look, the smaller neighbor is going to play games with you, particularly when you've got a much bigger power on the other side of your border, at least our land boundaries, which is China. Wouldn't we do that if we were Nepal? We would certainly play off China against India. It's natural. We have to accept it. That's part of diplomacy. That doesn't mean they're antagonistic to us. All our neighbors are tied to us by history, by culture, by economy. Where are they going to go? They aren't going to go anywhere. They know that if you're really determined, you can make it a real problem for them. So I think we have to be more nuanced in understanding. I think the government's policy is quite clear. I think Indian public opinion needs to understand, do you want to be loved or do you want to be respected? We are never going to be loved by our neighbors. But we need to be respected by them. And I think today they all do respect you. And I think that's important.
I think there's a third thing. Do you want to be loved? Do you want to be respected? Do you want to be feared? The third expectation is unrealistic because there are other powers available in the neighborhood. So you can be balanced. People will be Googling and somebody might ask if no two neighbors of ours have borders with each other, then how come Pakistan and China share a border? That's a tricky story.
They don't.
I know they don't. Because they only share that so-called border through the part of Kashmir that Pakistan occupies. Because
the Shaksgam Valley.
Yes, because if all of the... No, even Karakoram...
Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Yeah.
Pakistan occupied Kashmir, right up to what they call as northern areas now. That's all on your map. So Pakistan officially, in Indian point of view, does not share a border with China. And in fact, India shares a border with Afghanistan. Yes. Go ahead.
So I'm Suketu Shah. We've talked a lot about China and I'd like to just stay with it. Do we really have a full appreciation of China and its capabilities, its military capabilities, its economic capabilities? And do we have a strategy for it? I think even in industry, and I'm from industry, I don't think we really have a full understanding of its capability. And I'll give you an example. When when Trump first announced tariffs of 125% against China, and then for a brief moment, he went to 250, I asked a Chinese friend of mine who's based in Hong Kong. He has plants in China, in Hong Kong, in India, in Europe, in America, in Mexico. And I asked him, I said, what are you going to do? Are you going to do what Trump wants, which is to set up a base in America? He said, no. What do you think I'm going to do? I said, exactly that. He said, no, I am actually going to pull back all my plants, base them except for India and Mexico. I'm going to base them all in China, because the rate of change of productivity in China, whether it is materials, whether it's design, it's in every aspect, it is so great that he believes that everyone else will be knocked out in terms of their competition. And you're seeing that in Europe. Europe is experiencing the way Chinese cars are coming in and the competitive intensity. So do we really have an understanding of what China is, both, as I said, at the government level, at military level, and do we have a strategy for it?
No, I share your view. I think our understanding of China is very incomplete. And there are a variety of reasons for it. One is, of course, there is very little connection between the government and the strategic and academic and intellectual community outside the government. This is a problem which has been historical in India. The sense of suspicion that government has about strategic or intellectual or academics outside the government, so that the normal give and take between a government and that community which writes about international relations is missing. That's one part of it. But the second part of it is we don't have an ecosystem from the business and private sector which supports intellectual and academic activity either. In the case of the United States, for instance, industry funds the think tanks which actually power American interests abroad. RAND Corporation, CSIS, Council for Foreign Relations, Brookings, Carnegie, you take them. That's true of England, of France, of Germany as well. In our case, industry is unwilling to actually put funds to encourage scholars to write about China. And that essentially is a short-sighted policy, because you're not going to become a $10 trillion economy by selling goods to Indians. You can only become a $10 trillion economy by exporting goods outside. And to do that, you must have knowledge about that country. And that's why I think between the government's suspicion of the strategic community, which is non-governmental, and the inability of society to support academics in research, you have what is a total paucity of information on China. And therefore, we are all reading Western scholars. Now, the scholarship is outstanding, but the Western scholar writes from the American or the British or the German perspective, not ours. And therefore, you then tend to make a mistake, because you think you understand China, but actually you're only understanding China because you're looking at it from German or American eyes, not from Indian eyes. What you do need, therefore, is a effort, of course, by government to educate public opinion, but also by industry to support that academic effort, which is necessary to give employment to people who spend years studying a particular subject. And I think that's a pressing need of the hour, absolutely.
Dr. Rana?
Thank you so much for an excellent talk. In fact, you answered all my questions. When I go to Taiwan, to the hospitals there, everybody else except the doctor, they speak Chinese. When I go to Hong Kong, everybody in Hong Kong speaks Chinese. They don't speak English anymore. The medical doctors do, but they speak Chinese. So whichever country Chinese are there, now they've all started speaking Chinese. And they're very proud of being Chinese. And I'm not saying this just for the heck of it. So all the startups, each time I go and think, we are doing this, they're doing something better. If we get something for 10 rupees, they get it for 3 rupees and made in China. So I think, do you think that is what we're really lacking? And yes, sir, Taiwan wants to become Chinese. Taiwan wants to go to China. And as you rightly said, nobody can stop it. Because I see this all the time in the medical profession, in all these places where there are Chinese. Even the American Chinese are learning Chinese. And one of the most sought after courses in American universities is Chinese.
Well, Taiwan
the
is,
Asian study.
Taiwan is China, except the Taiwanese think they are the real China.
But
They are
they're
the real
proud to
China,
be
and
Chinese.
not CPC, not PRC. They think
And
they are the
thank you
real
for
China.
telling us that we need to have startups in India which are going to suit Indian needs.
Dr. Rana is among India's foremost neurosurgeons, and he comes from Kashmir, also goes back and does a lot of good work
But
in
that's
Kashmir.
another story. And thank you once again. Thank you,
Shailesh,
Shekhar.
we can take both together, yes.
Very quick question. China in 2017 had 1.6 crore babies born, 16 million. Last year it had 8 million, which basically means how does it impact China and how does it enable us or disable us?
Okay, that's actually something I've been thinking of for a long time, because the conventional view when I'm asked this question and when you talk to others is, well, it doesn't really matter because you are humanoids and robots are going to produce, so you don't need that labor force that you had, and I totally understand that. But an economy is not just a supply function, right?
Somebody
It's
has
a
to
demand
consume,
function.
consume.
Yeah, if a robot does not eat, a robot does not wear clothes, a robot does not go to a movie, and ultimately you may be the world's largest producer of goods, but if you don't have anybody to consume it, your economy is going to come to a standstill. So population matters at the end of it. So when people say that production from 1.4 billion to 800 million by 2075 is not going to make a difference, I agree. On the supply side, it won't, because they are all robots and humanoids. But 800 million cannot consume what 1.5 billion can consume, and therefore you have an advantage for. Although I did read in yesterday's newspaper that barring the 6 northern states, we are actually below the replacement limit in every other state of India. So I think the demographic dividend, if it was ever there, is not there any longer. Although we'd like to continue to believe it is.
That's the reason Chandrababu Naidu is offering money for the 3rd child and the 4th child. But you can force people not to produce more money, more babies, but you cannot force them to produce more babies. The Chinese have tried that. And you talked about Chinese soldiers being from single child families. This is almost the 3rd generation in China with single child families. So a child has no sibling, no brother, no sister, no cousins, no uncle, no aunt, no nephew, no niece. It's a very lonely world. So it's an interesting country.
It's an economic problem, because what you have is a married couple in their 30s now having to support 4 parents who are in their 70s, and these days they're all living to 80s, and they're all retired, a child who has to be educated, and you yet have to save enough money for your old age. And that's why just when Mr. Xi Jinping wants Chinese to spend, they're saving. And that's the problem with their economy. That's why the Chinese economy is facing headwinds right now. Because nobody is spending, but China needs them to spend because the exports, they're facing headwinds, trade defense outside. So it's a real problem for them. Demographics is having an impact in China, there's no doubt. It's going to have an impact on us also. Again, we are blissfully unaware of it, of course.
So before we come to the next question, two catchphrases which have been very fashionable lately, but both have come under question and both have been given the hard test of reality, geopolitical reality. One is strategic autonomy, and second is multi-alignment. And with that, I will link another. Do you think in India the military, intelligence, and diplomatic minds are thinking together or thinking alike, or are they working in silos?
On your last question, I would say that there's much more coordination now than there was even 10 or 15 years ago. The National Security Advisor and the National Security Council has helped that process. It's not an ideal situation, but I guess it takes time to let go of your turf, as it were. So I think that's happening. Sorry, I forgot the
multi-alignment,
yes.
and strategic autonomy.
One thing is very clear. I think what we have seen in the last 12 months tells us that there is no multipolar world. It was a complete myth. It's a multilateral world in the sense that two countries by themselves cannot decide everything, but it's a multilateral world with sharp bipolar features. And those bipolar features are going to get sharper and sharper because China and the United States are way ahead of everybody else economically, militarily, but most important, technologically. And therefore, what you're going to have is two competing technologies. If you take this one, you can't take that one, and therefore bipolarity is going to emerge. As far as strategic autonomy is concerned, I must confess after 40 years, I don't know what strategic autonomy means. It certainly doesn't mean nuclear weapons, which is what most Indians thinks it means. I think strategic autonomy is more an economic and technological concept rather than a national security one. For instance, I mean, a country like ours, can you afford not to have semiconductor fabs, even if it is a losing proposition? Because if you are aspiring to be a great power, you don't want to depend for semiconductors on anybody else. So that's strategic autonomy, for instance, at least to my mind. And I think there is an awareness in the government that strategic autonomy is more than national security, because you see some of these elements now coming in, whether they are defense corridors, whether it is the semiconductor mission and so on and so forth. But I really don't think anybody has ever defined strategic autonomy in an Indian context. I don't know. I mean, maybe Swasti, you might answer that question.
Well, I mean, strategic autonomy is something that you cannot basically define. So anything that you cannot define in a cogent, coherent manner becomes strategic autonomy sometimes. That's what I would say. And also about multi-alignment, it's a favorite word of mine because I think even multi-alignment is a very, very misunderstood term. One of the reasons why we keep having so many discussions on this is because as a country, we choose to not have a published national security strategy. And therefore, it is basically how you interpret it. It's a very constructivist lens of how you look at, certain constructs being made, which is there. But as far as multi-alignment is concerned, I think it would be a folly to think that India is having an equal distribution with all the great powers, small powers. I don't think it is at all like that, because multi-alignment loses meaning in the absence of stratification of interests. And I think it's the stratification of interests that we would be keeping in mind. And I don't want to take all the time here, but yeah, he mentioned a few. Also in the age of AI and the question of data sovereignty, I mean, the more you fine tune into these things, you kind of realize how little strategic autonomy actually exists on the ground. So we would like to have more room for maneuver, but I guess we are far from there.
Hi, this is Somnath here. Mr. Gokhale, all of us have this idea in general, for good reasons, that the Chinese are really great, both in strategy as well as in execution. Favorite quotes of Sun Tzu always appears with when somebody is losing words to frame themselves. But look at it this way. India was generally respectful of China from the time you mentioned Rajiv Gandhi's trip. We were reasonably sensitive to what they were sensitive to, and we expected certain amount of sensitivity from them. And that allowed them to maintain a disputed border, which is the LAC, with basically 2 or 3 battalions of PLA. We deployed some 10, 11 divisions, and that they were always deployed and somewhat forward deployed, not very good infrastructure, etc. But thanks to what they did in first Doklam and then, more importantly, Galwan, now we've forced them to match our deployments. Now here is a country that is as you mentioned, single child for now 4 or 5 generation, trying to teach India a lesson on the battleground, on probably the only space where they have a comparative disadvantage, which is they're trying to match us in population. They have singularly or significantly fewer young people to deploy than we do. And they have significantly more prosperous population from which to recruit people than we do. And they're trying to match us on that. So, for all the flex that we give them and rest of the world gives them on being great strategists and everything else, it seems that they've got it completely wrong. They're trying to fight us in the mountains. And from deploying 2 or 3 battalions of PLA, now we have forced them to deploy 50,000 guys and they have to be rotated out. This is precisely the ground on which we are most comfortable and they should be most uncomfortable.
The only thing is that, we have a problem on 2 fronts. One is they are fighting on the plains. It's a Tibetan plateau. So they can move their forces very quickly over 1,000-kilometer range, whereas you are going from 0 feet to 16,000 feet within 50 kilometers. So first of all, the terrain is against you. Secondly, the weather is against you as well. I mean, because of the Himalayas, heavy lift aircraft, helicopters, all have a problem. So in a sense, they are better placed, they are advantageously placed. I agree with you that they have very little fighting experience, and that as you get more prosperous, you are less inclined to fight. So, the soldier for soldier, I have no doubt that we are better, but their technology is superior to ours, and their geographical conditions benefit them. So, I don't think we should take the threat lightly at all, because otherwise we would tend to let our guard down. I think after Galwan, the government is very clear. We are going to have to pay through our nose to maintain those forces. But I think you have to bite the bullet, and that's what the government has done.
Also, the nature of warfare has changed now. So the warfare where soldiers fought soldiers now is very in the very distant past. All warfare will now be beyond visual range. So Galwan was an aberration. वो तो लाठी से लड़ाई हुई थी. But otherwise, warfare will be beyond visual range. You will not see your enemy physically, at least as human beings. That will not happen. No, not cyber. They are missiles. They are drones, and there are many kinds of missiles and drones. So warfare has now moved on. I think we in India tend to relive your lost battles, right? Because you want to fight them again and win. So we in India tend to relive 1962. But the world has moved on and warfare has moved on. It's expensive for China to maintain these forces there. It's very expensive, much more expensive for us, because we have to go through so much of mountainous terrain to get there. And people on both sides, when you're serving at 16, 17,000 feet, your hemoglobin levels go up because of altitude, low oxygen has enormous amounts of impact on your body. So it's not so simple. Question in the back.
Hi, my name is Premin. So you mentioned that China used to be reactionary, now it has become proactive. What we have seen with the crisis that we are facing, with crisis of Hormuz, Op Sindur, we saw that now we are moving, or we had syngas project starting in 15-16, but now the government has allotted money for it, and now we'll depend on Chinese tech and outside India tech. So we are still a reactionary country. So what kind of changes is required in our country, maybe through politics or in the people, that will make us move towards more proactive role?
Well, look, I don't think it's just the government. I think society, that includes the industry, has to do it as well. The fact of the matter is that many of the machinery that you import from China is imported because of the cost factor. It's available in Germany as well, or in Korea, for instance, or in Japan, but at a higher cost. I think at some point of time, if you want to shift supply chains, you have to either make it yourself, or you have to look for alternatives which reduce your dependence on China. It comes at a cost. Nothing is going to come free in any case. Either you invest in India, or you invest more in that machinery from somewhere else. But if you don't break that cycle, then of course you're going to continue to be dependent, because China's share in the world's global manufacturing is actually increasing every year. It's not reducing. Now, if the new export control rules come into force, which China has announced just day before yesterday, which is also going to squeeze exports of some of the intermediate goods and machinery, it's going to have a direct impact on your manufacturing industry. So I don't know when we are collectively, not as a government alone, as a society, going to wake up to the fact that you cannot be a global power without being a manufacturing power. And you cannot simply jump to services and think that you're going to be a global power. But that has to come from society. Government is not going to convince people in that regard. It has to come from our understanding as people that you need to make stuff in the country.
Mr. Gokhale, first of all, compliments for such a fabulous overview on China and its many different facets. You had a great experience in our own Indian Foreign Service, foreign policy. If you look back and start thinking that what could we have done differently and what's the policy that we should be adopting, It's a neighbor that we cannot get away from. It's a rising state, and it's complex. But we have invested a lot more in our foreign policy vis-a-vis the European Union or United States, but I don't think there has been, because of the level of mistrust or many different factors, that we have not invested in our northern neighbor as much as we should have. Your views on that? And another question. You've spoken about the rise of China and where it is going to be. What is, in your assessment, the biggest risk that China runs in the implosion that it can have from inside based on its political structure that they have? A democracy, we have a raucous democracy, we've seen how we sort of struggle, but we've come out of it. This is a command economy and a command system. What are the risks that they have for whether they're going to grow from here, or will there be a possibility of an implosion at some point of time?
Sunil Mehta has worked for AIG for a long time, which also means
really
he's worked with Frank Wisner for a very long time.
No, that's really an excellent question. And I think that's an extremely important question, because the world just assumes that if it's a single party government, it's just going to survive and survive and survive and all is well. And we've been very lucky that it has survived for 40 years when the world has prospered because of China. But history tells us that autocratic or authoritarian regimes collapse, and usually collapse catastrophically. And the fact is that there's been no peaceful transition of power in China after 1949 except on two occasions, 2002 and 2012. Before that, Mao Zedong's successor went out of the window. He tried very hard, it didn't work. Two of Deng Xiaoping's successors fell by the wayside, and the third one was not his man. Because he put in place two rules. One is, after 68 you cannot be a member of the party's highest body, and after 70 you have to retire from after two terms you have to retire from the presidency. Because of these two rules, in 2002 and 2012 there were peaceful transitions. Mr. Xi Jinping has chucked both those rules out of the window. The result is that nobody knows what succession is going to happen and who is going to come in his place. And if we go by past history, successions in China have been very messy affairs. Now, of course, when China was a $350 billion economy, it didn't matter. Where it is a $25 trillion economy, which it will be by 2030, it will matter. And therefore, we should all be watching with a certain amount of trepidation and even concern what the internal politics of that country might bring about as that man gets older and older and older without appointing a successor. But of course, we are in India. There's very little work done on China's internal politics. There is very little understanding of what its implications are going to be for us. And I really think we need to take a look at that. On the issue of the foreign service, I just don't want to relate it to China. I think the one big thing that we need to do is that we need to cultivate two talents that we have probably not cultivated so far, because I think the world of the 21st century, wars are not going to be fought on the ground. They're going to be fought at the negotiating table. And basically, for all the new technologies, there are no global rules. So if you look at it, nuclear, missile, civil aviation, maritime, trade were all 20th century problems with global rules. There's no rules for artificial intelligence, quantum computing, for cyber space, for outer space, for underwater, the new technologies. There is no rule. Right? So the world is going to set rules. We don't have people with a technical domain expertise in these subjects, and we have very few people with understanding of international law. If we don't have people who can assist the government in these two areas, we are going to be rule followers and not rule setters. And I don't think we are preparing ourselves to prepare not just the foreign service, but the government cadre as such, with these two verticals, because without this, you cannot negotiate. And you see this again and again. You go in a government delegation, it's basically bureaucrats. If there are technical experts, they're sitting at the back. But if you look at the Americans and you look at the Chinese, the technical and legal experts are up front and usually doing the talking after the opening statements, which are made by the functional head of the delegation. So I think that's the biggest challenge. How we are going to overcome it, I don't know, and it's not my problem.
I have a proposition on that which I'll share with you, that India should actually set up an international institute for regulatory development, where we are much more adept in setting up more contemporary regulatory architecture.
Well, I think right now all of India's qualification comes through the business of coaching academies, right? You go through a coach. It's true because if I see some of the curriculum in coaching academies and some of the lectures, I see them that young officers or officer candidates, some of whom will become officers, are actually already indoctrinated at the academies because they are being taught fake history, fake geopolitics, fake culture, fake economics. It's quite scary. It's very scary. It's very scary because now even the little bit of cross-fertilization that was there of getting people from outside to come and lecture and speak at the academies, that's gone now.
Thank you for a very insightful and interesting session. My question is on the transgressions. The focus all through the session was Chumar, Depsang, Doklam, and Galwan. Just want to take you back into history. 1986 Sundarangchu Valley. After Sundarangchu Valley standoff, did we actually not learn anything about Chinese tactics, about Chinese strategy? And that is the reason why today we are in a state of crisis or waiting for a crisis to happen right up to the time of 2020. Because 1986 was the time that the first time that a major crisis happened, which we were able to thwart militarily. So after that, right up to 2013, we did nothing. And after 2013, we have been having periodic crises from 2013 to 2020. And probably in the years to come, one doesn't know what will happen. So was the lessons of 1986 forgotten or not taken by both our diplomatic and military leadership? Thank you.
I would say that to the contrary, actually, we drew very great lessons from the Sundarangchu crisis, because what we did was we held the heights and we did not compromise until 8 years later when the Chinese finally had to vacate the place and you continued to hold the heights. So in fact, it showed that if you were consistent in your diplomatic posture, backed by some amount of military capability or military strength, and you held out for a period of time, the Chinese ultimately realized that you were not going to back down, and they backed down. And I think these lessons were applied during the Galwan crisis. The Chinese, I think, thought that with the deadline being the 2024 election, the government would come under pressure to concede or to sort of give way before that. That did not happen. And when the government came back to power, it was within months that the Chinese then finally agreed to settle the matter. Now, I do agree with you that some of these were not applied between 2000 and 2012 or 13. And that, as I said, was because I think we allowed ourselves to believe that the consensus which had evolved after Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi went to China would be good enough to maintain peace and tranquility on the boundaries. I think what the lesson we have now drawn is treaties may be in place, agreements may be in place, but circumstances change and nothing is permanent. And certainly with the Chinese, no treaty is permanent. For them, negotiation is only until they can change the balance of power in their favor. It's not a solution to a problem. So I think we've learned our lesson. And if you see from the more recent crises, we've been able to hold out. We've not budged from our position. And ultimately, the Chinese have come around to dealing with us.
So it's a question that a lot of people want the answer to. Has India lost any territory to China in East Ladakh?
I have no idea. I had left government 3 months before that happened.
But still, what's your understanding?
I don't want to comment on that.
All right.
Yeah, appreciate allowing the last question. Just, in short, Brahmaputra, and how would we, if it is possible to mitigate it, how would we mitigate it, to what extent?
Yeah, that's a very good question. See, I think the presumption is that if they dam the Brahmaputra at what is called the Great Bend, where the river takes a 180-degree turn around the mountain called Namcha Barwa, that in fact we would starve the Brahmaputra of all water into Assam and Arunachal and Assam. That's not a fact. The fact is that 80% of the catchment area of the Brahmaputra lies within India, along the tributaries of the Brahmaputra, the Dihang, the Siang, the Subansiri, and various others. So that is not the issue. The issue is it is in an extremely geologically unstable area. We know that the Himalayas are prone to severe earthquakes. The volume of water that will build up behind the dam will probably be the largest volume of water ever dammed in the world, because the Brahmaputra, or what is called the Tsangpo River in Tibet, falls thousands of meters within a few kilometers. It's just a natural hydroelectric spot for hydroelectricity, because the sheer force of the water runs the turbines. But if that dam bursts, the volume of water that will enter into India will actually completely inundate Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, and possibly even Bangladesh, because it will be a massive wall of water. So the concern is not the shortage of water. And that too is being redressed because government is now actually building dams on the Subansiri, the Dihang, and so on.
So some of this can be, some of this can be detained there.
Yeah,
to mitigate the impact.
Yeah, but the impact is still going to be huge. So that is the greatest concern. The instability of the geology there, and the sheer pressure that the water is going to exert on the Earth's surface. And nobody knows what's going to happen. The Chinese are convinced nothing is going to happen, but I don't know what's going to happen. Of course, government of India is fully apprised of the situation and it's very closely monitoring it. But what can you do? It falls within their territory. And China is very clear. They don't want to discuss river waters with anybody, even if you are a lower riparian. In fact, it's ironic. The Chinese comment on us being difficult on where the Ganga or the Indus is concerned, but very conveniently forget that they're the upper riparian in every single case and are completely insensitive not just to India, but to Kazakhstan, to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to Burma, to everybody. I mean, double standards, if you really want to study double standards, I think it's not the United States, it's the People's Republic of China which takes the cake.
So, Swasti, before you come in, there's a question from a subscriber, a very smart question, and very short. Narsimha Srinivas, does the outcome of the Xi-Trump meeting signal the end of Quad?
Well, I don't think it signals the end of Quad. I think it was to lay the floor on what was a collapsing relationship. And I think that's what they did. And now they have 6 months to actually come up with deliverables when Mr. Xi goes to Washington or wherever Mr. Trump, Mar-a-Lago, wherever Mr. Trump takes him. Now, what comes out of that is obviously something we are all looking at, because what you don't want is a G2-like situation. But I don't think at this stage that it has any other
impact on Quad. Swasti?
Well, I think all the points have been made, Shekhar. It's just that when Somnath asked about that military sort of angle, I think there's one thing that we need to study more seriously in India, because we keep referring to our military capabilities that are, in terms of Pakistan, there is a linear superiority, but with respect to China, their superiority is exponential. We keep referring to that, we keep referring to numbers and etc. and how much money they spend. But I think there's one thing that we need to study more carefully, and that somewhere connects the dots, to how they are wanting to save their people, and they're very sensitive to casualties. I think one of the things that China has started doing extremely aggressively in the last few years is that they have been getting their weapons battle tested, and they've been able to create a feedback loop, often in theaters that we do not study enough. So for example, of course, we all know about the PL-15 they gave to Pakistan against us, and then they sort of took their military lessons about improving it. Similarly, they sent HQ-9 to Iran, and then obviously it was basically to gather data on how the Western weapons perform. They have the same quid pro quo with Russia and the Russia-Ukraine war. But I think, for example, the Emiratis have been sourcing the Chinese drones and been using them against Houthis. So those kind of things are important, because that actually tells us that Chinese, even though they have not fought a military war, they are very active in establishing these feedback loops that continuously help them improve their weapons, even when they're not able to fight a direct war, and that would have implications. So I genuinely think that we should be talking and discussing, researching more on that. My 2 cents.
You have anything to add to this? Or?
No, that's.
So thank you very much. Thank you all. You've been patient.
Thank you.
This has been a great evening, and this has been a great tutorial for all of us. So thank you, Vijay, and thank you, Swasti, for joining in.
The Print Off the Cuff. Presenting partner, Edelweiss. Exchange partner, NSC. Experience partner, The Quorum. Gifting partner, VAHDAM India. Beverage partner, Chivas Luxe Collective Perfumes.